So we are going to begin. It's 9:35. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome all of you online and in this room. Online, it's a very international workshop because we have people from Taiwan, from Japan, and even from Toulouse. So this workshop today will try to explore the relationship between education and social inequalities in contemporary Japan. And we try to examine the dynamics that beyond the proclaimed principle of equal opportunity contribute to the reproduction or even the deepening of social and educational disparities. Through the combined contribution of two specialists in education, Professor Kariya and Dr. Entrich, the mechanism at work in Japanese educational system, along with their recent developments and their effects on individual trajectories, will be analyzed and discussed. Many of us are working on issues related to meritocracy, inequalities, and social mobility in Japan. So the aim of this workshop is to open a comparative and multidisciplinary reflection on the social, political, and cultural issues raised by this transformation. So as I said, we will have two presentations today. The first one by Professor Kariya. Donc, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Takehiko Kariya Takehiko. I'm sure that many of you know him and have read his articles and books, but I still will present him very briefly. Donc, Professor Kariya is a leading sociologist of education and inequality in contemporary Japan. After being professor at the University of Oxford, where he was affiliated with both the Department of Sociology and the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies, he is currently a professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. Before joining Oxford, he taught and made researches for many years at the University of Tokyo, and has been one of the most influential voices in the study of Japanese schooling, social mobility, and public policy. His works combines historical, quantitative, and comparative perspective to analyze how concepts such as equality, opportunity, and social class are constructed, implemented, and understood in Japan. Professor Kariya is the author of lots of landmark publications on educational reform, meritocracy, and the changing relationship between the state, families, and the schools. His research has shaped both academic debate and public discussion in Japan, particularly on the gap between the myth of equal opportunity and the reality of growing disparities. I'm very pleased and honored to have him with us today. Now, Professor Kariya will speak from Japan, and he will speak about the Japanese interpretation of educational inequality, a sociology of knowledge on translated concepts of class, opportunity, and inequality. So thank you, Professor Kariya, and now you have the floor, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for very kind introduction, Christian. Well, let me share the screen.
We cannot listen to you.
But can you see the can you see that page now?
Yes, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I love to come to Paris in a very nice season, but I still have teaching at Sophia University, so I missed the opportunity to come with come to this workshop and then having very nice French cuisines after the seminar workshop. But anyway, I will talk about, usually I studied social inequality, mostly quantitative method, but today I apply sociology of knowledge to understanding how Japanese interpret educational or social inequality through the lens of sort of the translated words. So the background interest, I will briefly explain. Of course, that most of you, all of you know that inequality is a major theme in sociology and in many countries. And sociologists address issues of inequality in their own research on social mobility and stratification, as well as in their studies of class society, gender inequality, or ethnicity. And most research adopt objective, structural, and quantitative approaches as I did before. So that usually they apply those kind of a method to national survey results. And then Japan is, of course, no exception. Most of you know that social stratification and social mobility research, every 10 years, I think Japanese sociologists, are conducted. So that so-called SSM survey. So that most of, social mobility or social inequality researchers in Japan uses that data or something else, on education, but mostly quantitative researchers. But how to understand the state of inequality in the society depends on the languages or words used to describe the state, which socially construct people's perception of the issue. Some societies, probably France as well, use the word class. I don't know how to pronounce class in French, but maybe classe or something. But in English, class is the word. As a typical social category or unit to discuss inequality, while other societies use other concepts which may or may not directly relate to the concept of class. But Japan is probably show you a very tricky case. Well, in Japanese, if you can read Japanese text, you may find that many sociological textbooks or many sociological academic papers, often the case, Japanese sociologists use kaiso. Kaiso, if I literally translate into English, that means stratum or strata. But usually, most of people in West, or writing in English or Western languages, they use class. So that what the difference is between class and kaiso. And if Japanese sociologists and lay people public uses the word kaiso to understand inequality, what kind of the impact does it have on people's perception? Well, this is just an example. You don't have to read the first part of Japanese, but one of the author in writing in Japanese, he wrote in the middle red line, red color part, kaiso kankaksa no suse, in English, trend in class disparities. That exactly same person, when he wrote in English, they use the concept of class, but in Japanese, he uses kaiso. Of course, that some of you know that in Japanese, class should be kaikyu, not kaiso. So that what the difference is between kaiso and kaikyu. But it puzzled me why Japanese sociologists, not only Nakamura and only his case, but I find many same kind of examples of using, in English, they wrote class, but in Japanese, they used kaiso. So that lays a puzzle. But one eminent sociologist who studied social mobility, Toshiki Sato, who wrote, I just translated his Japanese text like this. A major problem with the concept of kaiso is the way in which it is concretely categorized. That is, the classification of occupational categories. The English word of kaiso is class, while the English word for bunrui classification is classification. So the classification of occupational categories itself already defines the kaiso. Kaiso is not discovered from a social mobility table, but the very table is built on the assumption of specific kaiso classification. So that according to his argument, kaiso should be translated. Kaiso should be translated in English class. So that, but we have two words, kaiso, kaikyu in Japanese. So that, what's the difference between these two? And then that's sort of, I think, a confusion. I think I may make a problem. And then one of the eminent social mobility researcher in Japan, Imada Takatoshi, who wrote about class, well, in the late 1980s. In the past, the new middle class theory was significant as an antithesis to Marxist class theory, which pointed to a split between capitalist and working classes. But the middle class fantasy game has also led to the collapse of such middle class identities. As a result, it is now doubtful that there is even a class as an entity in Japanese society in the first place. So much so that the boundaries that distinguish the various classes have become diluted. Inequality still exists indeed, but the clear differences in lifestyle, values, and culture that distinguish classes have largely disappeared. When class terms are used today, it is only in jest, unless they are very anachronistic. So that in his argument, he's a very representative sociologist of social mobility in the 1980s or 90s. He wrote that, in that time of Japan, we shouldn't use the concept of class because demarcation or boundaries between classes blur. So that's why he said, "Oh, we are not living in a class society." So that's kind of a very strong emphasis is made by distinguished sociologists in Japan. Another very eminent sociologist, Tominaga Kenichi, whose argument is a bit different from Imada's, but very interesting. According to him, shakai kaiso, social strata, generally means the state of unequal distribution of socio-economic resources demanded by the majority of people. But unit of shakai kaiso or social stratification should be called differently according to the stages of history. Mibun or estate in the pre-modern period, social class in the early modern period, and then social stratification or shakai kaiso in the narrow sense in the late modern period. So that he divided the periods into three categories, and then the use of the unit of social stratification should be different according to the different period. Pre-modern, Mibun or estate, and then early modern, social class, and then late modern or contemporary, I think modern, that should be shakai kaiso or strata. So accordingly, for Tominaga, pre-war Japan was a class society, while post-war Japan become a more egalitarian mass society is broad line between social strata, so that social classes disappear. So that both two sociologists already mentioned in the late 80s and the early 90s, class disappeared in Japan. Well, another eminent sociologist, Seiyama Kazuo's view is another very interesting. He differs from early two people. Beyond the end of 70s, individualized societies had virtually eliminated poverty, so that essentially there was no longer any reason for the existence of class. So without poverty, he said, we don't need to use the class as a concept. However, this did not mean that elimination of stratification, instead that the spread of the basic goods throughout society caused stratification to become multidimensional and individualistic. This is the point. It is individualistic, not categorical, social categorical. So this is the state of stratification in late modern society. This point is same as what Tominaga mentioned that. And then quantitative stratification research, which flourished after the war, placed a great deal of weight on analyzing mobility tables, and the mobility research came to represent stratification research. This obscured the anti-class analysis tradition in stratification research. However, because stratification categories had to be used in analyzing mobility table, and on the surface, it is impossible to distinguish between the use of stratification categories and class categories. Continues. However, the concept of class is markedly distinguished from the concept of stratification by its inclusion of one other important theoretical premise in addition to the above. That is the premise of class as an agent. Of course, that you can see that Seiyama's understanding of class is based on Marxist. Marxist class must always, make a revolution, so as a social agent. So that kind of the interpretation has influenced strongly, I think, Seiyama's interpretation. But according to him, this premise means that an individual's objective class position in the social structure regulate his or her consciousness, a worldview, value, and therefore various actions ranging from consumption and academic achievement to social and political activities. In a stronger sense, the final action is linked with the formation of history. Thus, class as an agent is responsible for the development of history. The death of class argument includes the rejection of class as an agent. This argument is not new, although we cannot deny the impact of near-death sentence to the Marxist historicism by the collapse of the Soviet Union and East Europe. So the Cold War ended, that kind of the historical knowledge impacted him, to think, Japan or any society shouldn't use the word class as agent. So the main point of Seiyama's argument is Seiyama argued the estate system, he called the Mibun system, has played a key role in social stratification or inequality of political power, even in modern society. And inequality of political power is correlated with inequality in other areas of society, including the economy. So he said, it is important to take special note here of the fact that Japanese word mibun, while he translated estate, has no exact equivalent in English. So that particular Japanese word only mibun can express that appropriate unit of social stratification contemporary society. there were conflicts, but these were not rooted in the usual class interest. Classes that meet in the market as suppliers of different modes of production do not conflict. They are interconnected by mutual benefit. Conflicts are based more on the estate situation and the status situation than on the market situation. Well, of course, that I argue that that last statement is probably very controversial among social scientists. But according to his view, I think estate system is more important than class. That is what Japanese sociologists, mostly very famous, eminent sociologists of social mobility, all agreed we shouldn't use the word class. But how can a society have a class consciousness as an element of class, as agent, if it ceased to use the word class frequently? So that if Japanese society stop using, or Japanese public stop using the word class, how can we conceptualize, any stratification with the, similar equivalent concept of class? So that's a question. And then I will quote it here, Marxist sociologist reaction to those so-called modernist sociologists. I mean, so far I referred to. So Watanabe, who is a very eminent Marxist sociologist in Japan, who said the ideological motive of criticism against Marxist was the real political intention of the rejection of substantialism. And this ideological and political imperative drove Yasuda, who is another eminent sociologist who also denied use of class as a category of social stratification, from the banishment of the concept of class to the banishment of the concept of kaiso, under the banner of the eradication of the substantivist way of thinking. We hear against that chorus of sociologists banishment of concept of class. Well, I skipped the explanation of what Yasuda mentioned so that we just ignore. But I think Yasuda also denied the use of class. So that Watanabe criticized that modernist sociologists who, stopped using class because of its ideological rejection of the Marxism. But, there are several ways to, even in Japan, that we have several ways to define class. And this is a very famous, I think, sociologist and anthropologist book, edited book, Ishida Hiroshi and David Slater. And then in the book, they adapted Katznelson's categorization of class or levels of class. So that first level is probably you can accept it. Capitalist economic development, including ownership of and control of resources and means of production, definition of roles, capitalist, labor, and etc. But with no particular phenomenal form. Schematic of the motion of capitalism or its universal abstract logic are experienced far or even experience absent. And level 2 is a bit more, linked to groups. The social organization of society lived by actual people in real social formation under capitalism, workplace social relations, and labor market, the extra work patterns that result from these, including geography of industrialized cities and social networks, experienced close, at least experienced in some way. This is the level 2. And the level 3 is lived experience, shared disposition, cognitive maps, and the definition of probable life courses, shared values, and awareness of their sharedness, class culture, and interpretation of and responses to the economic patterns in level 2. And then finally, as all modernist, sociologists rejected, that is the collective action, that particularly rejected by Seiyama. So that the level 4 is the most probably strong definition of class with clear class consciousness. But looking back at the history of Japan, many of you knew that Japan experienced very rapid economic growth after the World War II. So that rapid economic growth, and then that makes a very fluid society in its absolute mobility term. So that Japan entered a period of rapid economic growth lasting approximately 2 decades from the late 50s to the mid 70s. During this period, Japanese society became much richer than in the pre-war period. Over the 70s, Japanese identified its society as an all middle strata society. Regardless of the objectively observed fact, people became aware that everyone was in the middle in their consciousness. So that because of that, the huge fluidity in the absolute term, going along with the rapid economic growth, many Japanese people felt, oh, I'm in the middle in the stratification in their consciousness. So then Murakami is a very famous economist who coined the term that sort of a group of people is not middle class, but new middle mass. According to him, these enormous numbers of people who occupy the middle part of Japanese society cannot be captured by conventional analytical concepts. They are not middle class in the sense that they are not just people occupying middle positions on the line, on a linear scale of social strata. They include not only white-collar workers, but also many blue-collar workers, farmers, and self-employed people. It is almost mass itself in terms of its composition, but at the same time, it is not the masses in the mass society theory, which defined masses as subordinate opposed to the elite as superiors and leaders. In all these meanings, I would like to call this enormous group the new middle mass. So that he refused using the class as concept. I mean, maybe in other countries we call it the middle class, but he refused to use the middle class. Then instead, he started using new middle mass. It's a very interesting statement. But all of those kind of arguments so far I presented have shown us, how in historically Japanese intellectuals stop using class. Okay. Oh, one more page. So that according to Murakami, it seems that mechanisms of structuration of class society are generally collapsing in advanced industrial society. What emerged from this is the collapse of so-called middle class and the dissolution of the clear boundaries of new middle class in the ordinary sense of the term. Instead, we saw the emergence of new middle. So that is something I think he tried to describe Japanese 1970s, a sort of uniqueness of Japanese stratification system. But what behind this? Of course, the absolute mobility rate changed hugely over the rapid economic growth period in 60s and 70s, largely due to a rapid decrease in farmers and the increase in non-manual and manual workers, which went hand in hand with urbanization. So that on one hand, urbanization proceeded, and then also the occupational structure changed. And then, of course, that if you look at absolute term of social mobility rates, it's huge. which was huge. So that, and then also if you look at education, at the same time, upper secondary and tertiary education expanded rapidly over the almost same time. And then I coined that situation a mass education society. And then mass production of consumption of public housing and domestic appliances provided a sense of homogenized middle, like 2-decade danchi, that is the public housing. Equally equipped with washing machine and black and white TV sets and refrigerators as a symbol of modern middle class or middle. And then simultaneous social changes occurred in the short period, which is often coined as complex development or complex modernity. Within just 2 decades or 3 decades, such kind of big change happened in the society. So that unlike in France or England, I think, which have had long history before, sort of the way of modern life prevailed in majority, you already spent many years. After industrial revolution, that you had, already had the working class people and the capitalist people. So that sort of, I think, length of history also matters. This is, this can be explained by the concept of complex development or complex modernity. So the huge change in the structure of society and social mobility. So that another new sociologist Sudo mentioned the number of people engaged in agriculture, forestry, and fishing has now declined substantially, and the portion of people working as white-collar workers has also stabilized. The percentage of children who go to high school has long since exceeded 90%, and the percentage of those who go on to university has reached 50%. So that after that huge changes, suddenly stability has come. So that there is no more room for change in social structure. Once we have majority of people are non-agriculture, and then majority of people now go to university or tertiary education, there are only few rooms for changes in terms of absolute social mobility rates. So that is, again, it's related to our consciousness or the view of our view on social stratification. So there is no more room for changing social structure, and the social structure has become much more stable compared to the rapid changes experienced in the decades immediately following the end of World War II. If it is difficult to properly understand the picture when society has changing rapidly, it will be easier to properly understand the picture as society settles down and become more stable. So the stability means less changes. That means that less room for lower ranked people to move up. So that kind of stability, I think, started since the 1990s. This is a simple example of the how the historical images, historical backgrounds among countries are different. This is the percentage of non-agricultural workforce, and then the top line is UK. So that even that in 1850, already I think the percentage of non-agricultural workforce is only 30% in 1850. And this is a line of Japan, even in 1920s, more than the majority of Japanese population in workforce were farmers. So that, but only that, 2-3 decades, it reduced to almost 10% in late 1970s and early 80s. I think this line is France, So that France is closer to Japan, but a bit different from the UK in terms of non-agricultural workforce population. I mean, declined. And this is the US. So that in the sense that UK, more than 100 years, they already had the blue-collar workers or non-manual workers, the majority of workforce were in such occupation. But Japan, just 2 or 3 decades, I think, from farming to other occupations, that kind of rapid change happened. But now it's very stable from 1980. So that's what the pseudo said. And that sort of, I think, historical background tells us why Japanese people, through the period, didn't have clear class consciousness, about which some, I think, socialists lamented. Well, this is an example of one economist, socialist, Kushida, mentioned in 1930. He wrote, most Japanese blue-collar workers have at most 50 years experience or less, either because they were the first generation or because their parents were the first. Therefore, there were very few urban proletariat who have repeated the life of blue-collar workers for at least 3 generations, including parents, children, and grandchildren. And this is unlike the workers in the UK. So that sort of a historical background also related to, which kind of the word you can use or what kind of a perception you have on social class social class mobility. But recent contemporary research also shows that Japan is not so different from US or Germany. This is the survey result from Ishida Hiroshi again. And then in his analysis, he compared Japan with US and Germany, and this is a distribution of subjective social status by nation. So that you can look at the middle. Japan is not so obviously that, middle class society, but like other societies too, I think that the majority of people belong to, I think, the middle. So it's not like the only Japanese case. So that he said, first, the distribution of responses are very similar across the 3 nations and the 2 time period. Second, there are 2 middle numbers, 5 and 6. The proportion of respondents who selected either 5 or 6 is shown at the bottom of the table. In the Japan, Germany, and the figures are almost the same. So let me see these numbers, right? On the basis of these findings, it is hard to confirm that Japan is the only country with a prevalent middle-class consciousness. The majority of people perceive themselves as belonging to the middle in all 3 societies. And then this is more or less, I think, sort of the class mobility table. So then he compared, I think, Japan, US, and Germany again. And I don't go into details about these numbers, but from this, I think, relative chances to class inheritance by nation, and that is shown by log of odds ratio. He interpreted this table. First, all of the rates are positive, implying that class inheritance is prevalent in all 3 societies. Second, the patterns of the inheritance rate is similar across nations and genders. The chances of relative inheritance are highest in the farming class, suggesting that this class has a high barrier to entry. The relative inheritance chances for the professional managerial class are also high in all 3 nations. The advantage of the professional managerial class is passed on from one generation to the next. But he said it's all 3 countries the same. not only Japan is exception. So that against that previous sociologist observation was their rejection of Japanese, class mobility. According to his analysis, both subjective and objective senses, I think Ishida's argument showed us, well, we are same as US and Germany. And of course, in the US and Germany, they use the concept class. So let me summarize up to here. I think Japanese sociologists stop using class as a concept. Instead, they start using kaiso, not kaikyu. Kaikyu is exactly a translation of class, but kaiso is literally meaning strata. So that why on what that it means to for people's understanding or perception of inequality. So that next step, I go to another concept in Japanese. That is kaksa or kaksa shakai. Well, in English, we translate a gap society or gap. Well, this is just the newspapers articles, frequency in Asahi Shimbun, how many, I think, articles included the words kaksa or kaksa shakai. So that as you see, it went up in early 2000. So that the kaksa is now the very common word. People start using since early 2000. But I don't show you this today. Alternatively, how many people or media uses byodo inequality, direct translation of inequality, I think byodo, it's much less. So that gap society without the concept of class, that is, I try to make argument. Gap or kaksa originally meant only difference, unlike inequality, which considers differences between social categories such as class, gender, to be unjust. The word gap or kaksa in Japanese does not contain any value judgment, and that it does produce an ambiguous social perception of inequality. Sociologists critically examine the impact of an individual's socioeconomic status or background, socioeconomic SES, in a gap society, but others, often political leaders, become gap as a difference in motivation, effort, and ability between individuals. You remember that, Koizumi Junichiro, former Prime Minister of Japan, in early 2000, he was in the post, and then he was the person who triggered, for Japanese media to start using the kaksa as a word. Of course, the media, I think, Japanese newspaper negatively use the kaksa, criticize that, expanding the gap. But Koizumi said, why not we shouldn't have the kaksa? That's kaksa is necessary for people to work hard. So that sort of the interpretation is possible. But if people had been using inequality, can you say inequality is okay? It's injustice. So it's not so easy. So what social categories are used to perceive issues of social mobility or gap society, kaiso or SES? So I argued it's a kind of situation in the knowledge world. Not the real world, but in terms of sociology of knowledge, I think declassification happens because Japanese intellectuals, particularly sociologists, stop using class. So declassification happens in their mind or their knowledge. So kaikyu, the translated word of class, sounds alienated from everyday language in Japanese, unlike class in English. Maybe in French too, I think class is very familiar in your daily language, I guess. But not in Japanese. neither, I think, a kaiso, but anyway, the word kaikyu is difficult to escape the political and ideological impressions that have been created by Japanese intellectual history. Besides Marxism, the concept of class has a rich theoretical background developed in Western languages, most of which have been translated in Japanese, like Anthony Giddens, Pierre Bourdieu, Savage, among others, and then Japanese sociologists often refer to those theories. And then if they translated their work in Japanese, they still use kaikyu. It puzzles me. But in their empirical research, they don't use kaikyu. That's the point. Kaiso may be an equivalent euphemism for class, but if this is the case, Japanese sociologists should explicitly mention that kaiso in Japanese means class in English. Unlike class, which is closely linked to the capitalist market economy, kaiso doesn't necessarily have the same connection to capitalism, but it's more neutral. This neutrality creates ambiguity and makes kaiso a less theoretical embedded concept or social category. The concept of class related to capitalist economy cannot help escaping the discussion regarding the class boundaries to create class categories in social theories and empirical research. Compared to the concept of class, kaiso does not necessarily require theoretical and political arguments about their borders due to its ambiguity as well as political neutrality. Without clear articulation of kaiso to class in English, the frequent use of kaiso may lose its theoretical connection to class theories in the West. As a euphemism for class, kaiso may be more easily accepted by the media or public without controversial political debates. So, intergenerational inequality persisted in capitalist society, including Japan. A core theoretical argument of social class theories explains how and why intergenerational inequalities persist in capitalist societies. Most theories of social stratification include these class theories as explanation of the persistence. Well, of course, that in French sociology, of course, that, reproduction theory, made by, Bourdieu and others. So that reproduction always, and the concept of capital must be related to a concept of capitalist or capitalist society. So Japanese sociology is no exception. Earlier generation Japanese sociologists had strong sense of anti-Marxism, as we discussed earlier, but the new generation continues to use kaiso, not class, with limited exceptions. But why, without making it clear that kaiso is a translated word for class, have Japanese sociologists used kaiso instead of class in Japanese? A duality of conceptions of a class society? Is this just a matter of language or matter of perception of a modern capitalist society? So more puzzles. Instead of concluding remarks, I will offer more puzzles. In terms of kaiso or socioeconomic status, what does the gap mean to society? Is it categorical or individual? Is it the same as the meaning of inequality understood by class? How does an understanding of society without the use of class relate to an understanding of capitalism? What is going on in the mind of sociologists who use kaiso and class interchangeably? When they write in Japanese, they use kaiso, but in English, they use class. So what happened in their mind? So, of course, that kaksa, a gap society, again, that linked with this kind of the argument. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. This is my talk.
So thank you, Takehiko, for this very rich and stimulating presentation. We will now move on to the questions and discussion from people online or for people in the room. I guess people online can speak from where they are, but here, if you have questions, maybe it will be better to come here to ask them. Please show that you speak better English than mine. So, no questions? So I will maybe ask the first one. Takehiko, do you think that the emergence of new terms or the changing the use of kaiku instead of kaiso, that means the change of conceptual frameworks could eventually change how Japan names and recognize, for example, educational inequality. I mean, until what point the change of the lexical or the words will change the perception and among the Japanese population, not among the leader or sociologists, but among the Japanese population.
I think before going into Kaiso and class, I mean that kind of the awarding. Although I focused on mainly that kind of a topic, but I think let's think of gap or kaksa versus inequality. That's the simplest. So that if we argue education inequality, 教育の不平等, I mean in Japanese, should be, I think, change that public perception to challenge that, education policy. And then behind that, I think if we can change the term from kaksa or gap to inequality or 不平等 in policy documents or newspaper articles or people's conversations, I think that change of the perceptions, I think also must be led by change of the concept of class. I think introducing class instead of kaiso. Because inequality just, shows the injustice, gap, differences, right? But I think the cause of, inequality should be linked with some theoretical argument. And then the unit of theory, I think theories must be, should be used as class, as other society. That is my argument.
But in this sense, how to act to, for example, the media really change how they speak about the question of inequality or gap. What tools do you have to make it change? How is it possible?
Well, I published books, articles, and then I just, raised the questions. Why? I mean, it's so taken for granted. I think Japanese never thought of the differences of the use of the languages. I mean, use of the words. I mean, how much the use of different words could impact our perceptions. So that I think the first thing that as a sociologist of knowledge, I think I try to persuade people to notice that the use of languages, word is very important to conceptualize or to construct any social problems. So that's the first thing. And then also, I think we try to, discuss with policymakers, particularly people in Ministry of Education. I mean, gap, kaksa is okay because many people used, but in the very important part should be used inequality, 平等 rather than 格差. And probably a higher hurdle for the administrators, policy makers to change the words like 階層 or 階級. But I think at least that we can start with using inequality, 不平等 more.
And do you think that, for example, the media are really aware that if they change the vocabulary, they will change the perception in the population? And if so, if they don't do it, it's because they don't want to change it?
Well, I have worked hard, but my influence is very limited. So that may not, I think, I'll be successful enough. But some, I think, intellectuals and journalists started notice the problem. So that, it's not so, sudden changes happen because language is most difficult part of institution to change, right? Social institution. So that's, but I think it's not a question of only language, but it's a structure of perception.
Mm-hmm.
So that I try to, but I'm not so powerful, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Can you come here to ask the question? Please. You can.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
J'ai parlé d'abord en japonais et après en français.
Pour les personnes qui sont
Merci.
en ligne, qui parlent français, qui parlent
Merci. Oui. カリヤ先生、ありがとうございました。僕、前、中国大学で学生をしてたもので、今、社会学、修士生をしているものです。今日、カリヤ先生がお話しされた、階層と階級の話の違いがあったんですけど、僕今、中学校で調査とかを夏にしていて、その時にやっぱり差別っていう問題がもう同時にあるかなと、カリヤ先生のお話もされてたと思うんですけど、教員の先生にインタビューをしてたりとかすると、差別をしちゃいけないっていう、気持ちで、階級的なものが語られず、階層的なものはニュートラルなものになっていくっていうのがあったと思うんですけど、一般の、ガラー先生が今おっしゃったような、一般の人々の感覚として、差別の問題がどういうふうにこの先生がお話しされた階層と階級について関連しているのかをちょっと聞きたいなと思いました。J'ai posé la question comme le sentiment de discrimination. Je pense que j'ai travaillé maintenant sur les écoles japonaises. Je travaillais sur le terrain et là-bas, les profs, toujours le sentiment, essayer d'éviter les discriminations pour les élèves. Par exemple, tout le monde c'est égal, c'est tout le monde c'est même chose. Donc si on a travaillé dur, on peut réussir à monter des classes sociales. Et ce concept, c'est vraiment fort au Japon, je crois. Donc, cette différence, c'est vraiment la différence académique, intellectuelle, mais en réalité, au terrain, c'est plutôt comme les gens parlent en tant que question de discrimination, je pense. Donc, les profs et aussi, les élèves aussi croient cette croyance d'égalité au Japon. Donc, oui, j'aimerais bien me poser des questions plutôt d'un point de vue des gens qui vivent au Japon à l'école, des profs, des élèves, tout ça. Donc, la question le sentiment de discrimination, et je pense que c'est assez important comme réflexion. Quelqu'un qui peut parler en anglais.
So can I answer the question?
Yes, sure.
I think the discrimination is the very strong word in Japanese context. 差別. I think school teach. You are talking about the middle school in Japan, right? Not in France. Yes, right. So that in Japanese context, a school context, I think 差別 is very strong word. I think teachers always avoid discriminate any students. That is the very strong norm. But Kaikyu, class probably sounded closer to, sort of inferiority in the Japanese understanding of the word. So that could be more easily linked with discrimination rather than, much more than, I think, kaiso, strata. Strata is a euphemism, so that it can avoid, I think, a sort of sense of discrimination. So that is something about that, how much that, for example, of course, poverty is a clear category of people by economic level of household. But I think you couldn't call any children or, any students in the classroom, you are poor. That's kind of the sense that Japanese teachers must share, that to avoid, giving a sense of being discriminated. So that choice of any words is very important to them. But it is one side of the story. The other side of the story is, because of that ambiguity, I think most of the case, Japanese schools or teachers do not understand educational inequality clearly because the lack of appropriate concepts or categories. Is that good enough to your question?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you please?
Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much for the very interesting talk about these developments in language. I was just reminded of a lot of discussions that we actually also have in Germany about these kind of things. How to use the term class, which is still often used, as you said, in English literature a lot. Not so much in Germany, I would say, recently. So we also started to talk more, as you introduced all these theories about social reproduction and so on and so forth. So more focusing on resources, on capital, with Bourdieu and so on, or Boudon also, making these kind of differences in how to describe inequalities within a society or the stratification. And so the things that we, I cannot speak for all the sociologists in Germany, but more or less is that we also try to avoid using class so much, as it is somehow ideologically framed in Marxist theory and so on, and very often it's thought as a little antiquated to still use it as this kind of concept, applying the class fight or the fight between classes and so on and so forth. So what we decided more or less is then also going with strata or something, which is more similar also to the Japanese term of kaiso, I would say. So this is maybe there's a similar development, at least in academia. I'm not so sure how we can translate it into a society. As I said, if we think about Sochoryu Shakai Japan somehow, and the great middle class society, and how this was then all people viewed themselves as somehow belonging. I think, of course, there's also always the wish that of people playing a role. Of course, you want to be middle class. You don't want to stick out in like one direction or the other. And maybe in other societies, it's not so uncommon to do the same. So this is also what the data of Ishida Sensei showed. So this is actually also, I would agree, it's not just a Japanese phenomenon. But what may be interesting is how well aware are like normal people about these kind of discussions that we have. And I would say for Germany also not so much, maybe only the things that we transport into policy somehow through interviews, through publications and these kind of things. And then if they get drawn up by policy makers and so on, and find their way into also policies directly. And as you may know, in Germany, we have a very high awareness of language in terms of equality. Inclusive education is one of the big examples that we could mention, but also gender-sensitive language, these kinds of things. And so there's always using classes is actually not something that is done so much anymore. So this was very interesting to also see this development throughout Japan, of course. Yeah, not that many questions that I have.
but thank you very much. I think that what Steve, I think what you mentioned and similarity, I mean trend in Germany, I think that's very interesting. And one of the extreme cases of avoiding using classes that class is social category, but stratification should be individual. So socioeconomic status is more individualistic way of understanding inequality. So that is either social category or individual. That is two extremes. I think in social stratification researches to use the analysis. And then, as you know, most economists research on income disparity or income inequality. Of course, they use individual as a unit of analysis, or household, not any kind of sociological categories like class or strata. So that is very interesting kind of argument. But you may remember that earlier my work in early 2000, I published in Japanese. I think I first criticized that education policies could expand that education inequality and social inequality. But at that time, Ministry of Education denied. They denied it. And although they didn't have any data, I had the data, but they didn't have any data, but they just denied it. So that means they didn't want to accept that kind of the problems are happening in education and inequality. So that I think, and then of course that at that time, Japanese educators and policymakers of education believed, oh, Japanese education is very egalitarian. It's a kind of a myth. So that I challenged the myth, so that at the beginning, they didn't accept that, my problem making. And then, but later, I think in the 2000, and then gradually the society as a whole become more unequal. Then the Ministry of Education admitted, yes, we have the problem. And then they did the survey to measure how much the parental, education income influenced on children's academic achievement. It was, I never imagined that, when I first time, I think I criticized them. So that gradually, maybe this is probably the answer to our question before. I think we can gradually change that, mindset of people. Thank you, Steve.
We still have time for questions, so please.
Oh, raise the hand.
Je vois pas. C'est pas moi.
Yeah.
Please, Gaël, you can.
はい。カリア先生、こんにちは。発表していただいてありがとうございます。とても面白かったです。私は、博士課程で森の幼稚園。
Gaël, please, there is people online who doesn't speak Japanese.
Yes,
So if you can ask
okay.
a question in English, it will be better for straight.
Yeah, okay. So I will switch directly in English. It's better, maybe. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm working on 森の幼稚園 and 野外教育, which is like reconnect education to reconnect children to nature. And I compare this kind of schools and kindergartens to the education system in Japan. And I would like to know if you think that using kaksa or kaiso, more neutral words to means class, is it a way to give the responsibility of inequalities to the population rather than using kaikyu is a way to would be a way to protest against political decisions and give responsibility to the governments. And so if we use kaksa or kaiso, it's delete the power relationship between population and the government. Yeah, it's my question. And do you think this kind of ideology is translating education when we ask to students to I don't know, to do their best without say anything, like 我慢しながら頑張るしかないという考え方で。
You should say in English
Okay,
that part. I mean that people don't understand what you said that in Japanese. Is that okay? Well, maybe I will quickly answer to your question because, of course, the use of language is very important. But probably what I'm going to say this time may sound contradict what I already mentioned earlier in my presentation. But I think a Japanese culture, one of the culture, I think, characteristic is ambiguity. I mean, not making things so clear. So it has both pros and cons. And then, of course, the bad side is, of course, that to make unclear so that people didn't notice that what seriously the problem is, how seriously the problem is, so that but with using the acute, very clear languages, we can understand what really situation is. Okay, that is one thing. But ambiguity also produces harmony. So that avoiding acute conflict or divide. In some countries, I mean, the class divide is so clear and clashes. So that's something happens, but with them using the milder languages, which may create harmony. So that, of course, that harmony results in, I think, probably postponing the solving the problem of inequality, probably, but also it can avoid very clear, divide in the society. So that is, I don't know which is good or which is bad, but I think we should think both sides. But I have stood on a long time that on criticizing inequality. So that's why I mostly, I think, I use the very acute or accurate words, I mean, to describe a situation of society. So that given the very clear languages, of course, we can more critically, I think, challenge that the policymakers, but it may cause divide in the nation. So that's sort of a dilemma. I've seen many countries now facing a clear divide. So that may be not easy to make the, conflict and divide. I mean, that more mitigate. So that is something we should think of too. That answer to your question, I'm not sure, but I think your Morino Yochien or something, that is another interesting example. I think, well, for others, I think Japanese education system has very interesting nature. Top level and first level, I think kindergarten and university, these two parts are have a large number of private institutions. And in the middle, very public state systems. So, but university, 70–80% of universities are now private, and the kindergartens, I think 70–80% are private. So that's again, parents have to pay more money, tuitions, to go to good kindergarten or good private university. So that is not just simply a problem of class or kaiso inequality, but it's also related to the nature of Japanese education system. Okay.
Thank you. There is a question online, so I will read it. A question from Vladimir. So he thank you for your presentation. And he said, in today's Japanese sociology, how can we interpret the frequent use of kaikyu by Hashimoto Kenji, who wrote several books where he strongly defend the use of this term?
Yes, I know. He's a very powerful sociologist, I think, who published many books on class, titled with class. And then his recent book, it's substantially and then successfully showed how much that class divide happened. And then one of the serious arguments he has made is the current class system in Japan cannot be sustainable because underclass people couldn't reproduce themselves. That is his point. So that it's a sort of new understanding of class reproduction, because class system cannot be reproduced without supporting the lower end class people, underclass people. So that is very influential, I think, argument and an evidence he has provided. So that I very strongly, I think, agree with Hashimoto's, I think, research. Thank you very much. I think I didn't mention to Hashimoto, but he's the exceptional sociologist who used, I think, empirical research to show how class is important in contemporary Japan.
Thank you for your answer. So Vladimir, thank you again for your answer. Is there any more questions? No question?
Can I, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please. Ask your question.
Me?
Après, Gérard. Après.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry
Yes,
for that.
Please.
Okay. Yes, I'm referring to the use of the word mibun that was mentioned in the early part of the presentation. I'm wondering if, because this word is used in referring to the present status of people in the Koseki, and I wonder if in modern Japan, this word's understanding is now in the mind of people is neutral as a simple administrative term, or does it still convey in the mind of people a remnant of its indication in pre-modern Japan of the social position of an individual?
I think the latter is the case. I think still, if you know Japanese language, do you?
Yes.
Okay, and then you know the word, like kind of expression, mibun chigai, difference in estates. It's a criticized. I mean, if you in a group of people who are different kind of a sense of mibun or belonging to estate, and then I felt, oh, I'm a mibun chigai. Oh, so the kind of negative meaning, of course.
Mm.
And then, of course, that mibun sounds still, I think, sort of, I think, feudal. So that means the pre-modern kind of sense, as Tominaga mentioned. But I think according to, I think, Seiyama, another sociologist, I think he wanted to modernize the words of mibun. I mean, more neutralized. So that's the probably his use of the mibun is less, I think, feudal, less negative, but still he wanted to use the mibun instead of class. That is probably the point of Seiyama's argument.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have now the question, please. You can ask your question.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I really love it. And I think Taiwan and Japan has a similar issue on education inequality. So I have a small question for Professor. My question is, if the concept of class is not really commonly used in Japan, then what could be done to make social inequality more visible or more better addressed? Thank you.
So that, well, as I spoke at the lecture, I think Kaiso is the concept, strata is the concept. I mean, replacing the concept of class, mostly used by Japanese sociologists, but not so often used by the media. I think media, I mean, didn't use the clear social categories like Kaiso or Kaikyu. So that means, I think they can just describe inequality as kaksa, gap. So that I think blurring the social category is a problem. I think. I mean, we didn't use the clear cut, different categories. But of course, the positive side of that is the it creates ambiguity. That is, make a harmonization of society. So that's something that I just talked a bit before. But that's something I think the choice of languages. I mean, the media. I think. They don't use either Kaiso or Kaikyu or class. So then that's very interesting because in the case of gender inequality, they use the word gender in long words from English to Japanese. So they use the, just borrow the sound, gender, 不平等, gender gap. Or something. So that, I mean, but to talk about income differences, for example, they just said that income difference, I mean, based on individual, not categorical. That is my understanding. So very vague way of use of the social categories, I think, to talk about the inequality. And in education too, I think.
Okay.
That
Thank you.
answer the question, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Oh, good.
So maybe I will ask one last question because we have to keep on the schedule. And beside the work, Claude. So please, Claude, first. Mets le micro. C'est bon.
Okay. I try to be clear. It's not easy. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was extremely stimulating and important in many ways. And I'd like to refer to some personal experience in junior high school in Japan, in places in which the teachers were much involved in trying to diminish or erase issues related to the book, to the racial or discriminations inside the schools related to Burakomi Mondai, to the problem of discrimination in society. And they had committees working with the students coming from those discriminated areas and helping them to try to have better results, knowing that on a statistical level, they were strongly in difficulties in their learning process. I had many discussions with teachers at that time, and I remember very well that at this local level, many teachers were refusing to refer to any theory, like the Bourdieu theory of reproduction, that would stress personal or collective background issue in order to, and they refused that because they thought that using those background issues, they would not empower the students, they would just give them some sort of liability to say, well, that's because that's the reason why I don't success. That I have social problems that forbid me to be able to succeed or things like that. So the idea was to empower the students. They had to keep fighting outside of any macro type of theory that would explain in social terms why things were not going as they should, why inequalities were reproduced this way. And that was a very strong sort of moral commitment of the teachers inside the schools. That was in the 90s mainly that I remember those discussions with teachers. I think it relies a lot with what you were saying today about how wording things, how the word we use can, on one sense, give us a better understanding of the processes of injustice inside society, but on the other hand, can as well increase the gap, increase the divide inside the society. That's what I mainly kept thinking, listening to your conferences. I hope I was not very far from what you were trying to say. That's my.
Thank you very much. I think it reminds me one of my research I've done. I did a long time ago. I had data from I think a group of supporting Black people. I think Black 교육研究所, I forget the exact name, but kind of a research institute for helping, I think, students in school, I mean, from Black origins. And then they allowed me to use their survey data. And then as a sociologist, I used various, of course, that I used various, at the time, a bit, I think, sophisticated method to measure the effect of their Black origin versus their parental education and occupation, which part are more influential on students' academic achievement. Okay, so that I try to divide the effect, either class variable, Black variable, that is probably more important than further occupation and then education, that can be categorized as class. So that class versus Black in the simplest way. And then I found class effect is almost important, more important than Black. And then, of course, that Black, I think, influences go through class influence. So that I think it's not separated. Of course, that in the class, in Black people, their class position is lower relatively. But I think that if direct effect, if statistically we can measure, I think effect of class is as strong as Black. But it's a surprise to them, the researchers in the institute, because they believed Black is the matter, not the class. Probably that kind of findings, which your talk reminded me, related to how larger picture of a society or big theory can explain, or micro level interpretation of daily based, I think, student teacher interactions. I mean, what kind of wording they use related, I think. Is that answer to your question?
Yes, actually, I had the same experience. I remember discussions in which I was in the school in which the Burakumin Mondai was a very strong issue, and teachers were very strong. The union was very strong, and the guys in charge, they even have one teacher fully in charge of the Burakumin problem issues inside the school. So it was at the beginning of the 90s in Hiroshima. And I remember a discussion with that guy who was permanently hired by the Kyoiku Inkai, the local Kyoiku Inkai, in charge of those questions. And I remember telling him exactly what you were saying now. I mean, somehow the Burakumin, the fact of being from those origins, has a weight, but seemingly that weight could be explained eventually better by economical and familial type of issues. And they didn't like it at all. I mean, I had a strong reaction, but because for many of those persons, whether it be Burakumin problem or it be social, economical, and cultural familial problems, it's the same thing. All those theories will just work as a screen that forbid the student to take charge of his life and just to get over it and work. So they didn't want to take those issues into account, and they were not at all willing to help me having statistics about the impact of those dimensions. So yeah, similar experience, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Regarding the Braque, I think it's related to the issue of Mibun too. I think, of course, the Braque probably is Mibun, not rather closer to Mibun than class. I think that's something I think related to the previous question of Mibun.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the questions and thank you for your answer and your presentation, Takehiko. We are going to make a little break, about 10 minutes, and then we will begin again with the presentation of Steve Entrich. So from now in 10 minutes, please. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, all.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
And it's clear that we could speak about this question for hours, but we have to stop it, sorry. So we are going to continue the workshop. So the second presentation will be given by Dr. Steve Entrich. He is a sociologist of education, specialized in comparative research on social inequalities and educational trajectories. He currently serves as a co-head of the Japan Transnational Education and Career Plan Study Project at the University of Zurich, which is very lucky for him because he has only research to do now and no more teaching for 4 years. He completed his PhD at the University of Potsdam with a landmark dissertation on shadow education and social inequalities in Japan, from which he published this very impressive book. Since then, he had held different academic positions in Potsdam, Freie Universität Berlin, Zurich, Innsbruck, and Duisburg-Essen, and has conducted research stays at leading institutions, including Doshisha University, the German Institute of Japanese Studies in Tokyo, the University of Tokyo, and so on. Donc, Dr. Entrich's research focuses on comparative educational sociology, with particular attention to educational decision-making, returns to education, life course dynamics, and the role of transnational, supplementary, inclusive education, and of course, shadow education in Japan, but also in Germany, the United States, in a cross-national perspective. He is the author of numerous publications, including the not the forthcoming, but the already published volume Youth in Time of Crisis at Springer, but which don't speak about Japan, as you told me, as well as recent article. You have some on the slide. Today we'll speak about educational competition and status attainment in Japan revisited, from school to work to happiness, which is a broad agenda. And we are delighted to welcome him today. And well, Steve, now the floor is yours. You can come here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and to have the opportunity actually to talk. I will try to direct my attention in several directions. And share the presentation with, no. Just a second. Make it full screen. All right, so now you should be able to see the full screen here and back at home or where you are in your offices. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining and for expressing your interest actually in this. I think the presentation we just heard from Kariya Sensei was very interesting, very engaging, and we had a very founded discussion already about the concept of class, of also inequality and these kinds of things. I'm trying to approach the issue from a different angle, providing more empirical data, also empirical analysis, but also trying to involve it also in theoretical discussions a little bit more. So I think this is actually a good follow-up. So the topic of my talk today, you already heard, is about educational competition, status attainment in Japan, and try to revisit it in terms of doing a comparison between different cohorts of youth in Japan, and looking there at their school to work transitions. You could also say school to somehow first university, then work, and then also happiness, which is also a very hard term to measure actually, but bear with me and we'll try to get to it. So the whole idea comes from also a book from Kariya, maybe the Mass Education Society, where you also cited something like you first have to go through the best juku, then you have to go into the best high schools, to the best universities, then you can enter actually big companies and have a happy life in the end. So there's like this old traditional perspective of the ideal Japanese life course, mostly for males, of course. And from this, starting from this kind of viewpoint, I asked myself, okay, today, in comparison to other earlier cohorts, maybe, how can youth in Japan actually find happiness? Is it still the way, or if it ever was, actually going through all these kinds of things and these troubles that actually that actually come if you have to go through Japanese education system? And can they arrive at a certain point where they say, I'm actually happy with what I have achieved based on all of these? Or do we just find a lot of inequality and unhappiness? All right. Okay, and so we start. This is something that I did in my seminars when I was teaching at the University of Duisburg-Essen the last years, and I had an international group or international students in my classes, so they came from everywhere. There were a few Germans only, like one or two mostly, and then we had many Japanese, Koreans, and several other nationalities in these classes. And I always asked in the beginning, because it was a class on social certification in Japan, and also with this viewpoint on education, what do you know and what do you think you know about education in Japan, about school to work transitions, also then afterwards this labor transition and so on. in Japan and an extension of Asia. And this is what we got. So I tried to make a mind map of them, and they could then just put in their answers, and then we automatically got these things. And it always looked a little bit like this. So what we see here are things like competition exams that are mentioned very often. So the bigger the words, the more they actually mention those. We see things like overwork. We see juku, these cramp schools that you have in Japan. We have something like job hunting seasons, non-regular workers. So these are a lot of terms actually that have a negative connotation somehow. And especially the things about competition, conformity, and juku and so on are very much related to education in Japan and the perception that people still have about the very stressful, maybe, Japanese school life that students have to go through before then arriving somewhere later on. And you saw this maybe in the first picture, it was also on top here. We have all these, this is Kyoto at the Kamogawa, where a lot of middle schoolers are living. And what is always interesting to non-Japanese is then, of course, this kind of uniformity that you still find with the school uniforms, that everybody is doing somehow the same things and behaving very similar, which also relates a little bit to what Kariya was telling us about this kind of harmony that you just want to stick to, you just want to belong also, which is important in Japan, of course, and which you find in the education system a lot, and it's also taught better. So to start off, to better understand where we're headed, first a small introduction to the Japanese education system that you may know or may not know. I'm not 100% sure how much you know. But then what we already heard, there's kindergarten, which is mostly private in Japan, so a lot of money to be paid. And then we have the compulsory schooling system. The compulsory schooling system is primary and middle school lasting for 9 years. And then afterwards, we have the first threshold to actually move through. So first big educational decision that the students together with their families, of course, have to make before they go on to high school. And as I said, it is only compulsory up to this point. So you don't have to go to high school, but as Kariya Sensei also told us, the percentage of students going since the 70s already beyond 90%. So almost everybody goes. Today it's we have these numbers to the Shingakuri, so the rates of going over from middle school to high school is 98%. So almost everyone. If you drop out at this point, it's not something you should do in Japanese society. It's not well regarded, and there are specific reasons for this. Afterwards, there is already, even though it's a single track system, so everyone somehow moves through the same system, there are already big difference from this point on. So what we find at the high school level is there's already a ranking going on. In top high schools, bottom high schools, and a lot in between. So it's very important at this point to make the right decisions for the next step, not just going to high school, but making it maybe to better prestigious high school. After that, you have to decide whether you drop out of the education system, go into the labor market. There is not really, as you can see here, there's not really an interposition of governmental vocational training. So the vocational training is happening in the companies and so on. So people just enter the labor market directly and get trained there. At this point, as we see here again, 58% decide to go on to university or shopping universities. But then there's, of course, more in the tertiary education sector. So summing up to around a little more than 80% is tertiary education. So a little more than 80% of the Japanese students actually go on to some kind of tertiary education. And what we also see then is only leaving 70% of them going directly in the labor market after high school. So on average, we see that the Japanese population has very high mean education, mean schooling years later. So then the third threshold for those who did not go to the labor market at this point or that point, so for most of them it's 80%, is then going into the job market, and from there, hopefully achieving something that we would call maybe a happy life, which would be preferable, of course. And this is what we are going to look through, actually. So what is happening on your way there? To do that, we need a background. The background in Japan, we heard a little bit around developments and so on. And there was a point when politicians decided to actually change something in the Japanese education system. And as you may know, of course, there's always been a lot of praise about the Japanese education system for its supposedly high efficiency. equal opportunities. So this was always the thing. You had high efficiency, high excellency, and high equality of opportunities, which is something that other systems do not achieve. For that, it was praised a lot. You have all-day schooling, which is also a good thing, and high quality of teaching, and so on. And this was always used also to show a little bit, to say why Japanese education is very good, and we should maybe learn from it. In the 80s, a lot of Americans actually went over and tried to use these things, and then after the PISA shock in Germany, but also other countries, Japan was also on the list again of potential role models to learn from. But then always the argument comes, the culture is too different, so it's a little hard to implement. But be it as it may, what we can see here is the outcome of the PISA study. You may know the Program for International Student Assessment. And this is from 2000, it was running up to 2022 was the last iteration. And what you see for Japan is they always perform. So it's only 15-year-olds, and they always perform very, very high. And even during the pandemic, they achieved higher scores, where all of the other countries in the world, and it's like they're close to 100 countries now almost, but I think around 80 right now participating. Japan came out on top of these countries, especially among the OECD countries. So something seems to be happening in schools in Japan that works, that pushes students to high efficiency, performing very well in these international comparisons. And we have tried to explain this, and there are, of course, a lot of theories, and you could also go into how schools work, how classrooms work in Japan, and so on, and find out why this is the case. So beyond this praise, there's a other side of the coin, so to say. We're also in the question, why can they achieve so high? It's not just the schools. So there's a little more happening. And so there was a lot of criticism, not just from outside of Japan, but also within Japan. And since the 70s going on, about the rigidity and the uniformity of the school system, the highly competitive excellent culture, also the Juken Jigoku, so the excellent hell or overheated education was mentioned a lot and criticized, of course. And the consequence of this, so this, you have to memorize everything, you have to, it's very dull. There's a lot of pressure, conformity, there's a lack of creativity, so we also have a lack of potential new leaders later who go into the economy and actually come up with new innovative stuff and develop and so on. And we have an excessive use of shadow education term that you already heard today. In brackets is Gakshu, Yogiko, and so on. So these kind of cram schools that help you improve your academic performance in school, but also, and a very important function is to prepare you for entrance examinations, for high schools, for universities, and so on. And then again, there are some identified excesses of this. So all this competition that is happening for the best schools, first high schools, then universities, has actually, or has led to very worrying cases about that we discussed a lot since the 70s about pupil suicide. There were some very prominent cases, especially in the 80s. More and more student delinquency is something that is argued is happening, more violence even. And then we have the topics of ijime or kutoko, so bullying between students, more students skipping classes, and even the breakdown of discipline in school classes. So it doesn't seem to be all good if you think about what I said before, all this praise. There seems to be something amiss here. Shadow education said that the Juku boom is something, and this is why it's discussed since the 70s. It was a huge increase actually in participation in these kinds of schools. I'm not sure whether you can see it, but what you just see there is that during the 70s, there was a real boom of these kind of private schools that were founded at the time. And so more and more seem to have a need actually to use this kind of extra tutoring outside of regular school hours to prepare for all kinds of things. So overall, we have a lot of dramatic media reports about disturbing conditions. And this actually led policymakers also to a decision to say, okay, we have to change things. This is making education dysfunctional. There is this Kyoto Kiki, so there's a real education crisis happening, and we should address this. Took them long enough because since 1977 they said, okay, we have some new guiding principle. We call it Yutobi Kyoiku, so relaxed education or education for pressure, something like that. And we will implement certain things to actually make things better. They took a long time. 2002, then the real measures were actually implemented, but they were significant. So what we see is by 2002, the school curriculum was reduced by 30%. So imagine how much this is during a school week, having your school curricula reduced by 30%. It's a lot, and you, of course, a lot changed due to that. They also went away from the 6-day to the 5-day school week, and so on. There were many other things. Important here maybe also they tried to change the entrance systems for universities and high schools, meaning that it should be easier to actually move on to a high school or to a university also on alternative ways, so without taking necessarily the entrance examination. Whether this worked out, we will see. So, but all of these things, of course, had the big goal to reduce pressure on students, reduce competition, and by this also reduce these outcomes that I showed you, student suicides and ijime and all these things. And today I would like to try and look whether this is actually something that happened and to what regard and so on. First of all, what we can see here, I hope you can see it, is the development first of the population of students. So you see here school-age children of the different parts of the education system. You see they used to be quite high here, and this is where we are now. So what we see here is the demographic change of Japan, very clearly. So the number of students is just going down for a long time. So the last day here, now it's going down. And here it's around 2020 now. And so what we also see is, this is the one trend that we have less and less students. The other trend that we see here is that these students get educated more and more, so that the proportion of students actually within educational competition is not shrinking, even though we have less and less students. So there was a big idea, of course, if we have less and less students, then competition will just become superfluous and abandon itself, along with shadow education and all these things, because then there are enough seats at universities for all the students who want to go, and we don't have to pressure them into anything, and there is not so much competition. But now the thing is that what you see here is a bar for people going into university. You see just increasing. So the proportion of students going to university is just getting higher. There's an international global trend that we see everywhere, education expansion happening. So Japan also becoming, of course, a mass education society, and this means that competition is not going to, or it's not lesser maybe, but stay the same or even increase, because more and more actually just want to go to university and achieve these high degrees. So they have to go through this whole education. So now we can actually see whether, so this demographic change should actually make the biggest impact, and it may not so much as we had hoped for. So now we have to see whether other things actually can work out. So the theoretical frame I'm using to make this clearer is the Coleman's bathtub, which is quite easy. So you have a macro level, you have a micro level that you look upon, and you start with the social situation that I just described. So we have Uteri happening, we have a reduction of workload and so on in schools. We also have demographic change, which is also in favor of decreasing competition and so on. So there's actually a lot happening over like 2-3 decades now that should help students move through education more easily and reduce some of these unnecessary or unwanted consequences that we saw. So this has an impact on individual actors. Then this impacts, of course, how they act, what kind of decisions they make, how they go through life, and so on, and to set their actions. And this then has an impact back on the macro level. So on society as a whole, maybe. This is why we can then maybe do that now is sparked up. That's why it's called like that. And we could think that if they are able to make choices that come from heart, maybe a little more, they have less competition, reduced threat, and all other consequences that are negative, maybe, that on a societal level, there is some real change that we can actually see. And this is the thing that I'm trying to look into today, and later on also with some more empirical data, actually. So what I'd like to focus on is education, competition, and then related risk factors such as what we saw, bullying, truancy, and things like that. Okay, so the questions I'm addressing are these three. We need to know, of course, how these factors, education, competition, risk factors, affect the happiness at the end. So if we think about this life course perspective, so where do they end up? Then the question that is even more interesting is whether there is change over time. So yes, this kind of implementation of U-theory actually led to considerable change between cohorts of students. So the younger generation versus an older generation that did not came in the that were schooled before U-theory actually happened. And then the third question is the look on inequalities that we have in Japan. So whether this actually impacted on a broader level also inequalities between students because of these created opportunities that are now there and should be there and should help also overcome, if we want to say class-based inequalities. Yeah, and so in the first part, I would like to review a little data on these things, literature, and also theories a little bit, try to make it short. And in the second part, I will present empirical analysis. So addressing this question again, who's actually going to university, who is not going to university? We see here the number, or the new entrants and applicants for the Entrich, which is the Central University Entrance exam in Japan. And what you see here over time, since the 90s to now, is that even though we had all these reforms, also reforming the system in a way that you can now access university with recommendations and so on, and you don't have to take this entrance examination anymore, the numbers are quite stable. Only now they're beginning to drop a little bit. Right? And what we see, what is important here, is that the people who actually get admission to universities by recommendation, so not because they took the test, is very high now. It's around here, around 50%. Right? So the meaning behind these numbers is that although half of the students now get into university without necessarily having to take it, they still take this test. They do both. So what this means is stress is not necessarily reduced, but it's even enhanced. So they prepare for all of this to go through all the exams. And then on the side, they try to actually do extracurricular stuff and so on to get recommendations from their schools and so on to actually get into a good university, which is an extra effort that you need not necessarily take if you would just focus on this, how it was before. So I have my doubts whether competition actually was effectively reduced. The first thing. The second thing is shadow education. So extracurricular tutoring. And you see for Japan, as I said before, the number of students, citizen students during compulsory schooling who were involved with some kind of friend schooling, so to say, it's quite high. Developed, as I said, from the 70s when we had school. And then more and more, you see the participation is around 80%. So quite high. Now we would think, okay, maybe it went down. The latest numbers actually show it's still very, very stable throughout the years. Here you see only Juku, and there are other types of tutoring that you can use, like having a private tutor at home or something like that. But these institutions make up the main part of this industry. And you see it's still pretty stable. And I wrote in my book, actually, there's also a chapter about why this is happening and so on. Feel free to read it because there are some reasons why this is. And of course, a simple answer would be this industry is very flexible and it reacts just to all these changes. They know what was happening and they just reacted and then tried to just get more students in, have new strategies, have new offers on what to do, and took off other functions. Also, Shinroshido, so this placement counseling that normally happening in middle schools, was then also moved more outside of schools. And so they actually advise students what is the best school to go on from this point on. So there's also no real decrease visible in the data about these kinds of things. So it seems that Juku remain a key part in educational success in Japan. Other problems that we still have, as I said before, we have suicide, we have delinquents, we have bullying, we have truancy, and so on. We have overly strict school rules, and you may know about this. There are so many things. I just gave an interview earlier this year to the Swiss radio, how's it called in English? Rundfunk. I know about these things because there are some things changing here as well. So there are now discussing to lessen these school rules. So they already did it in some prefectures in Japan as an answer actually to these very, very much increasing student suicides over the pandemic. And we'll also show you some data there. Whether this will have a big impact is, of course, also a question, because it's not that all schools do it. And what they do is maybe out of 500 rules, we maybe abandon 5. So this is a little, yeah. So media reports, if you look through the media recently, are very similar to what we found in the 80s, actually. We have still the same problems discussed over and over again. So drill in Japanese schools, there still things like corporal punishment. We think like, okay, this is something from a long time ago, but no. Then bullying in Japanese schools is especially traumatic, of course, and there are also some new studies showing that it may have a long-lasting effect. Suicides, highest level ever, actually, after the pandemic. School rules in Japan, these things that you have to wear black hair and these kinds of things. There were some cases where people who have naturally not black hair had to diet to actually fit in. And of course, this is what I said before about school uniforms and so on. And this relaxation of strict school rules. Okay, coming to some data also on Ijime, Futoko, so whether you're mobbing or truancy, as I already said, it's only increasing. So all the Utri fuss was actually about these things. I try to actually reduce this kind of these kind of things from happening, and what we see is that the opposite seems to be happening. That there's a very rapid increase in people being mobbed at school, people trying to skip school. Overall, if we compare to some OECD data, it might not be the case that Japan is an outlier in this regard, but it is an international thing. So on average, international OECD average might even be a higher numbers of students reported to be bullied. But there's a little problem with this, of course, because the definition of what is ijime or what is bullying can be different in countries. Yeah, then of course we have online bullying, which is the new thing to do, and much easier than it used to be. So you don't have to face your victims directly anymore. You can just do it online. Student suicides, as I already said, and to just see it here, what kind of increase we are talking about, it is a lot. Then of course there are some studies trying to find out a little more about the reasons for that. There's of course many factors that play a big role for why students commit suicide. Academic reasons are there; they make up maybe 20–25%, something like that. But are not the only thing, of course, that matter to go this long way. But anyway, we have to say things like ijime and not getting along in school and so on. Also worries about future prospects, they play a role for this. So of course people get anxious about many things that are related to things happening in school and to the kind of competition and outcomes that we're talking about. Labor market transitions. So the next step. So when you went through university or maybe after high school, you left school or you go to university and then afterwards you want to opt for a job. There's something called the Shujokatsu, Japan's traditional job hunting system. This is structured mass recruiting that traditionally happens once a year, and then everyone is recruited to right from the spot. And this is also a lot of pressure and stress in the last year. Normally in university, it's shifting earlier and earlier, actually. Go there and present yourself in a very uniform manner, so everybody has to look the same, has to wear the same clothes and so on. Behave a certain way. There are many rules again, how to present yourself and what to do. And through this, you can then get into the best positions and get a good job. Of course, as I said, there is a little change happening, also a little related to demographic change. So the drinking population, of course, if more students go to universities, that's the one thing. But overall, you have a lot of labor shortage in Japan that is addressed a lot, and also in policies, if you follow them a little bit, you see that there's also a reason why immigration is more and more discussed now in different directions. Yes, so what is happening also now is that big firms try to snap up university students earlier to get the highly skilled graduates earlier. Other companies, the smaller companies, they have to now get high school grads or mid-career hires more and more. So there's this shift of just not being able to still get people. And so there is a new kind of competition happening in between. So what this means is it matters even more maybe nowadays to have a more specified skill set. So what we're talking before about was traditionally you went to a good university and the name was enough to just get your jobs. This kind of security is not the same anymore. So there may also be good to have some extra assets to really come out on top. So we see this as a gradual change. Overall, what we still see, and so there's no big changes, that getting into employment in Japan is very easy. If you also look at the numbers for youth unemployment, they are lowest in international comparison. So there's not really that Japan has problems in this direction. So that's all working quite well. People get hired. But competition within getting hired and so on. And what this means is, if you think about Shukatsu, that's just a very small little study of 100 participants. So it's not representative at all. But I just want to have something to show actually it's connected between mental health and job hunting. Because if you think about like all the stress that you're going through, many people report having suicidal thoughts during this, or having just a lot of stress, depression, these kind of things. And this is something that you find a lot. And but I think also it needs a little more research still. But this means there's still much to look into, and actually much of this actually affects whether you're happy after that, right? Whether you can actually fulfill maybe a dream or something like that. Theories to actually then explain inequality related to all these developments. So more and more people actually achieving higher education, still having to compete a lot. It's easily explainable with, for example, of course, social reproduction theories in general, random choice theories, and so on. The effectively maintained inequality hypothesis may be even better. So I picked this here because it nails it down to a specific point. If we experience education expansion, such as we visit in Japan and in France and in Germany and all the industrialized countries, to a degree where we have very high proportion of people going to universities, inequality the absolute level of inequality actually is reduced. So absolute inequality of opportunities and so on is reduced because you can go. It's easier to use the term class for working class students to go to university. That's true. So inequalities, they shift. They do not disappear, but they shift to different levels. So and why is this the case? Was, of course, families and those families with higher SES, or with more resources, so to say, with higher capital. We could also use habitus and all these kinds of things. They, of course, seek opportunities to secure for their kids some advantage over those others, and they use everything they can find, so to say. And they do this very effectively. This is why it's called effectively maintained inequality. So what we see then in effect is that students from well-off, more fluent, higher SES backgrounds, they are more likely to go to higher-ranked schools, higher-ranked universities. They are more likely to go to Juku and Yobiko and so on. They are even more likely, or should be more likely to go and do Shukatsu more intensely, and so on and so on. And by this, then increase their chances of having a very well-paid, attractive job in the end, and a life that they want. So 3 hypotheses I'm going to address who relate to this. The first one would be students who participate in intense education competition of different nature and or experience adverse conditions in childhood, so during school, are less likely to report than being happy in the end. So if you have to go through all of these things, it's very likely that it's taking its toll on you, and you may not be as happy after going through all of this. The second hypothesis is that there is actually change between cohorts. There's actually no change between cohorts. So we saw all the data points to this, that we have some interesting stability in certain kinds of risks actually happening, certain kinds of inequalities still persisting. And the third hypothesis is then that we, even though I'm thinking back to the Coleman's bathtub, we have future reforms, we have demographic change and so on, that inequalities in education, self-attainment in Japan actually have not shifted to a certain, in a certain way. So we could say there's a substantial decrease in inequality across cohorts. So there's, we could still maybe say there's a taxa shakai there. All right, the empirical analysis, to back this up a little bit or look into this a little more, I use data from the Japan Life Course panel study for the youth, which is provided by University of Tokyo, FSJDA, the data archive they have. And it's an ongoing panel study, and the reason I use it is actually I have data on all these things that I just showed you, and we can also make a comparison between 2 distinct cohorts, one pre-uterine and one post-uterine. And what you see here first, I also have some indicators for satisfaction at least, and 4 different ones for overall satisfaction with the life they were asked, with work, with relationships, parents, and friends. And if you look at those, we do not see a very clear picture yet, whether they are happy or less happy. There are just minor differences. So we see that they might be the mean might be a little happier maybe in certain regards, but it's not like super clear picture that there's so much happening. Okay, the data I used for SES or for the student's background, I used a variable due to a lack of income data for these, which is hard to get sometimes. I use a scale that is measuring, it's a numeric scale actually, but class identity. So you see the original term is how you could say how was the lifestyle when you were 15 years old. So thinking back about this, and then whether you said yourself you were more poor or somewhat poor, you were like the average or wealthy. And what you see is what Kariya has also shown, because most people go like around 50% and say, oh, we are somewhere in the middle. This is what you always somehow get, also other studies actually show. And what you see over time, when you use to generate, there's not so much change. But there are a few less saying I'm in the middle, few more saying I'm better off, but or at the time, not really significant differences. If we then look at some factors that may be related to competition between both cohorts, we see that attending Juku middle school is the same. There's no real change, even though there are several years in between, and we thought there should be something happening, but as I said before, it seems to be quite stable. Data just shows this again. For high school, we see even a little more here. Top high schools, we have students who they have to say how's the rating of the high schools they are taking. It seems that more in our sample at least went to better high schools. So the ranking is dependent on the how to say the gokakuritsu, so the proportion of students making it to universities. So the high schools define themselves by how many students of class they can actually send off to university. And of course, due to education expansion, it went up. And so in general, we have more students actually belonging to schools, where more students go to university. University enrollment, as I said, education expansion, of course, went up. as expected. And then we have shukatsu. And the question here was how enthusiastically they actually pursue shukatsu. So how much intensity. And it ranged from not at all, so there nothing, very low, and then up to very enthusiastic about this. We see that students very enthusiastic about shukatsu. It's actually a higher proportion now than it used to be in the pre-Yuturi cohort, which is unexpected a little bit. And it should be the other way around, and it's not. So this is all pointing a direction that's saying, okay, we have not fixed the problems that we saw and wanted to fix with Yuturi. Okay, then we have these other risk factors that I was talking about. So we have a variable about situation in school. You could say it's maybe about the school climate. So there's something not good in school, which is a little reduced actually, which is good. Mobbing, as we already saw in these other data, has gone up. Skipping classes is going down a little bit. School groups we also had is more or less the same, so there's no lessening of these kind of things. And the proportion of students skipping class at the school level also went down. So I'm not using all of them later in the bigger analysis. But to make some first associations clear, I'm not sure about the time. I have to. Okay. Yeah. So we have first thing, we just look at correlations. So we have the student ratings, and we're just looking at correlations with the overall life satisfaction. And we see that factors like satisfaction with work, friends, parents, and so on have now a bigger impact in this young cohort than they used to. So it seems that there is this connection is getting stronger between things that take place maybe that affect your well-being. Then we have SES. There's no big change. Only we also look at parental education. We find no effect anymore on your well-being or on your life satisfaction. We have education competition factors, Juku and reputation of schools and these kind of things. There's no real change, so it's very similar. What we see has changed is if we look at the impact of the income that they have. So when we think about where they are at now, so they're just beyond finishing university or something, they have their first early 20s income. And this income used to have an impact on how satisfied people are with their lives at the same point. And this is not having this kind of relationship anymore. There's also something that we find in the overall literature in industrialized countries that economic things, so income and so on, seems to have less and less impact on well-being, happiness of younger people, because other things may become more important. Then what we also see about these risk factors, that the negative impact that you, of course, assume of bullying, for example, on how happy you are later on. So we're talking about bullying in middle school, and this is when they're in their early 20s. And so the average level of being satisfied with their life is still affected negatively when they were bullied once. We see that this relationship actually increased, so negatively increased. But the effect was becoming larger, actually. Okay, now it's getting a little more complicated because we're trying to get all these factors into one model. And we just started simple by SES, so the socioeconomic status of the students at age 15. So there's one variable where they just say where they are at. And we want to arrive at this, what I call happiness, based on all these factors where the students said how they feel and how they situate themselves. So now we're going through the life course of the students of these two cohorts. And you have the old cohort left and the new cohort right. Okay? So what you see now is first the effect of your social background on whether or not you attend a high-ranked school, a high-ranked high school. You see, of course, that your family background plays a big role for whether or not you make it to a better school, even at that point. And, of course, has a big impact on your performance in middle school. And this then, of course, also impacts this. So this is still easy and very, very much expected. The problematic thing here is actually It's super stable. So we see almost the same effects in both cohorts. There's no real change visible. Then the next step, you want to go to university, or you drop out, of course, or do something else, go to a college or something. And just this, it's just a 2-digit, or just a dummy variable, whether you went to university or not. I don't have the ranking for universities, otherwise it would be much more interesting and much stronger, surely, also this kind of effect. But we still see a significant effect, even beyond your whole school and performance and everything control on whether or not you go to university. Of course, it's important what kind of high school you're at. If the high school has higher ranking, then you're more likely to go to university. Performance is important. Performance to performance and so on. So, and what we see again, stability. So there's no real change happening actually in this regard in what you have to do, how you have to perform to make it to the university in the end. And we now also look at Juku in between. I also control Jukus in middle school, but I'm not showing them here. But at this point, very important, whether you go to a Juku depends on your family background or not. And this association actually increased. So the people from higher backgrounds are even more likely now to go to a Juku than they used to in the 90s and 2000s, before usually. And then we look at, okay, if I get a better ranking high school, there's also very big impact or very high likelihood that I go to a Juku during high school. This in turn has a huge impact on whether I go to university. Okay. So now we're going to the next level. Sorry. Again, we see family background has a very long arm. It still impacts whether you do more or less shukatsu, so job hunting, right? So it's still a direct effect, even the point where we control for everything else. The same also for whether or not you attend a bigger corporation in Japan. We still, oh no, then we have a negative version. But what we see here is we have a company, or the bigger company, so the old idea was I want to become happy, so I have to make it through school. And then I can get into like one of the major companies, Toyota or whatever, and then I become maybe happy. So attending university, of course, is a big effect on whether or not I can do it, whether I can secure a place in a bigger company. Doing shukatsu also have a big impact on this. And their first difference maybe comes. So first it was like being at university, and then it was very likely to make shukatsu. Now this extends to other students as well outside of university. They're also very likely to do shukatsu. And what we see here is a direct effect actually on your happiness level also. So whether you're or not you're very satisfied with your life right at this point, early in the 20s, with all you have achieved, depends a lot on how much shukatsu you did. So how much stress you actually went through to do that. So then we have income, of course. If you made it to a bigger company, you would have more income. This didn't change. So the SAS effect is only a little bit like here, and you see that it has increased on these factors. But what we do not see, it's not that I didn't show it, but we do not see some kind of relationship between getting into the big companies, having higher income, on how happy they feel at this point in time. It's not affecting that at all, which is interesting for both cohorts, actually. So this is more likely a myth that you go through all of the stress and then become more happy once you made it to the big corporations. That's not so much the case. So finally, we also look at what kind of schools they attended and whether they were also bullied during that time. And if you are at a school that has a certain school climate that is not top-notch, so where are certain problems, it's also more likely to get bullied, and this relationship increased a little bit. Also used to be that from lower SAS backgrounds, you got more likely to get bullied, and this actually disappeared. I have no explanation for that. Something to consider. And then we have truancy, which is also related to the school environment. And the interesting part then is, and truancy, of course, is also more likely to come from a lower background. You're also more likely to skip school. And this impacts still a lot whether you go to university. So if you skip classes out of specific reasons, and also your performance, of course. So if you skip classes, your performance will be lower, which affects everything here. Especially middle school performance is most important, and it also negatively affects whether then you make it to university. So then we also see, if we look at happiness, if you were bullied, I teased it before, you're less likely to be happy at this point in time. In your early 20s, you're much more likely to be less happy in this relationship from the last to the uterine cohort. So then we also have a relationship, or we used to have one from the performance on happiness. So always this kind of relationship between education and happiness was something that in literature you find could be bigger. And then later years, if you look later on, people with higher education, like university on, there's always this kind of relationship. But at this point in time, it's not there. So there's no value at this point in the early 20s for your own feeling of happiness or not. So now the last thing that I can show you is how much this is still impacted by your social background. It's the biggest effect in the whole model. And it's super stable, as you see. It's the same for both cohorts. That when you came from a less affluent background, you're still hung up on that, even after going through everything. It's very, very stable impact on not being so happy or being happy. So if you're coming from a better background, you will have social networks, social security, and all these kinds of things that may enable you not just to go your way easier throughout all these institutions, but then in the end, on a general level, just feel more satisfied with everything that you have in your life. So not too much changed for the better, actually. So coming back to the three hypotheses, so is that change? Little change is all, but not necessarily to the better. So education and competition, we see that in part they are positively related to happiness. We saw this more in terms of shortcuts, for example. What we also saw in the model, I didn't say it, but if you went to a JUCO in a high school, you're also more likely to do more shukatsu later. So these kind of things being involved all the time, not just in school, university, but on the side, all these kind of activities, something that is just pushing people through. The risk factors, of course, if you have been bullied and things like that, then you're less satisfied maybe with your life. So if we then look at the change between both cohorts, we see remarkable stability of effects for educational competition. So even though we have this uterine cohort, which got reduced workload, 30% of the curriculum, as I said before. In the beginning, later they reduced it and they were 10% more again, but still they went to school at a time where it's compared to the 90s, but just very different. Should have an impact, but we don't see this at all. So there doesn't seem to be much reduced competition due to maybe other factors that we also more talk about. These risk factors, you see just small effects. I think the most interesting thing is also truancy and how this has this general negative effect, of course. If students somehow skip classes, then this will very negatively affect their general school life course. And of course, EGMIS. So it's still a big problem. It's getting bigger, actually. And we see these negative effects still under control of all these variables directly affect how happy you are in your early 20s. And there are analysis from a colleague from Todai actually showing is also affecting mental health and so on in your 20s. Yeah, what we could say is the protective intentions actually of uterine did not substantially mitigate the negative long-term well-being effects maybe associated with competitive pressure at various school environments. So this is a little problematic. What we also see, if we look at inequalities in general, you saw these red arrows all the time from socioeconomic background. they're very persistent over time. So this supports actually this effectively maintained inequality thesis a lot. And you could look into the research on social reproduction and so on. There's a lot of support for this kind of perspective that higher or well-off families actually secure for their kids some advantage wherever they can commonly find these advantages in the Japanese system, as in other systems in other countries as well, but we see this very clearly here. And there is no decrease in this kind of behavior and actually also success in doing this. The toll of the youth, their health and so on, this is a completely different story that we should look into maybe more. Then what we also see is that the impact of this Q class or Q SES hardly increased actually. So we see that there is increase on whether or not you go to Juku, to top high schools, whether you do Shukatsu, and then overall your status attainment. So this is also something to talk about. Thank you so much.
So thanks a lot for the presentation. So question time, we can take 20 minutes, I think, to ask some questions, maybe a little bit more. I just have a question. First, I really want to thank you for your very rich presentation, and I'm very happy that we recorded it because I think it will take time for me to understand the final video.
Yeah, sure.
Which is quite difficult for me to understand all what you said. I will have just, at least I will have just one general question. That is, the question, you take Yutori Kyoiku policy beginning as a marker, as a mark to distinct pre-Yutori and after Yutori.
Yeah.
But is it really pertinent to use the question of the Yutori? Because in fact, the Yutori Kyoiku was implemented in very short time. And in my opinion, I'm not sure that I know there is all a speech about Japan, about the Yutori effect on the performance of the skills of the students. But if we really preach the speeches about what really happened in the classes, I mean, the change. I mean, usually for educational reform, to have the result of an educational reform, usually you need 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And you can't see really what's changing. You need to have time to see what the true results. In Japan, if we said that the Yutori Kyoiku was implemented in 2002, we can also say that it's almost finished in 2008 because they changed the official program directive and they increased again. That's Yutori Kyoiku. So is it possible that we really have so important? Could we? Isn't it normal that we can't really see important change because in fact the implementation of the Yutori Kyoiku didn't have time to make real results. I don't know if I'm clear now.
Yeah.
So what's your position on this?
I thought about this question a lot because you are right. What we in education science always say is that reforms in education take about 100 years to actually reach everywhere.
No, but not 100 years, but
it takes time. Yeah.
Works in Quebec or in Canada, but they show that at least you need 10 years. At least.
Yeah. The thing with the Yutori Kyoiku was, as I showed, they started much earlier in the 70s to discuss all this and to prepare. And then in the 1989, they implemented or initiated and implemented it. And what they have in Japan is, of course, as you know, that the curricula, they, at least for public schools, compulsory schools, we're talking only, right? Not high schools so much, is that every 10 years, you have this change agreement only. So this 1998, they discussed, and then they decided on what to do, and then to cut it by 30%. In 2002, they actually effectively cut the curriculum by 30%. And so this is one way or another. If you look about, it's not about the content so much, but the time to just teach these contents was largely reduced, even in the core subjects. And then I also had a new subject where you have this individual learning time and so on, where teachers didn't really know what to do with and tried to use it for homework and stuff like that, maybe. And also some research showing that the shared education industry took advantage a lot of this. Also because, of course, the backlash of teachers' unions and parents and so on, saying that you cannot change this. How will my kid will be get prepared enough actually to make these transitions to better schools, to universities? How can we make sure that they actually reach their goals if you just reduce everything to this degree? And what effectively happens is, of course, they went outside of school and they still do the same work. But in school, they had to reduce it. So there was no way coming around. So this, from the standpoint, this official standpoint, should have had a big impact. But then, of course, if we think it on a societal level and what else is going on around, you're totally right. It's and this Tatsu-Yutari later, where they reduced again, was only happening in 2012 implemented effectively, where they have a 10% increase. So this still means 20% less than in the 90s of curricular time that they have. But the focus shifted again, more on core subjects, more on also PISA-relevant competencies and these things. They also adjusted and implemented 2008 a new national assessment test, which they didn't have for a long time, to additionally test the students. So you're right. They also somehow discredited Yutari a lot. And Yutari was just implemented in 2002. There was this big Gakuryoko Teika Ronso, I think was it called. That of course the academic achievement of the students is going down. We have to do something, and they just implemented it, so it couldn't take any effect. But they used the PISA study again and compared the results from 2000 and 2003, and they said there's a little drop in mathematics and also in reading and so on, which you can show empirically is not a reason actually to use these. But this led to the backlash on Yutari and then to the change in the next round. But this is still a 10-year frame where it somehow worked or had to work. And so I see the problematic, and I know that they just shifted things around a lot. So this is the big problem.
You can see it on two ways. One is really to reduce the charge on the children. And the other is to put the competition outside the school on the parents' budget so for me, I think it's the question of Yutari Kyuriko it's a big, very complex complex way to speak about the evolution. And after I was in one of your graphics, you show that the Yutari Kyuriko had an influence also before and after about the interest at the university. There is, I don't know which slide it was, when you compare the I don't know, can you try to
I can, yeah.
You can.
I can. Okay.
Maybe.
So which one are you referring to? Which?
Donc, it's much more further.
Yes,
No, it's not this one. Well, from the 21, but I think it's 22. 23. I don't know.
Okay,
No, it's not this one. No, after. Okay. No. Oh. There is only this slide with this kind of graphics.
Yeah.
So the 22. 1 before. Okay. University, and for example, using pre-Utori curriculum or after Utori generation for the university enrollment. Is the difference linked with Utori curriculum or the fact that because of the demographic crisis,
yes,
it was impossible? I mean, private university need more and more students, so they enroll lots of students who before never had the idea to go to the university.
Yeah.
So for me, this kind of graphic here, it's not Utori.
No.
It's not Utori.
Yes. Yeah, you're completely right. But it's not. It's nothing to do with whether or not Utori was implemented. It was just the term of education expansion going forth. What this just means is that we have more and more students going to university, and this is of course not reducing competition, but it puts more students actually into the field competing for.
Yeah, but at the same moment, we have more and more students go to the university, but they more and more enter in university without the examination.
Yeah, they do.
Because for me it's different. After you show when you got 30% of a generation who enter in university on recommendation or I don't know this one. Well, this one. It's okay that they do both paths. They try to examination, but finally enter on recommendation letter.
Yeah.
Right? But for me, it's completely different. The stress or pressure is completely different than if you only have the examination path.
Exactly. Yeah.
So for me, the new situation again, according to the demographic crisis, changed completely the rule to enter in university, and this made the stress or the pressure on the students less and less important. I think it's not just for me. They don't use both paths. In fact, when they do examination, because parents want they take examination, but in fact they know that at least they will enter university in one way or another. So I think it's a little bit different from the situation before. No,
it is. Yeah, sure. The point I was just making was that, and this is an outcome of Utori. This kind of new pathways that evolve, so that it's actually becoming more flexible, the whole system. Yeah. So this is actually something that we have through Utori, but it did not help individuals to actually get an easier way through these different transitions and so on.
Yeah.
But rather than that, they have to get more information, they have to prepare maybe different avenues. And then, of course, if you want to play it safe, it's like most families try to play it safe. And of course, you invest in all possible outcomes to a certain degree and say, okay, might be good to get a recommendation, but then if you don't, you should also prepare maybe and take the entrance exam. Is also what we know, what we did when we were young or something. And so maybe try to somehow do everything, because we have to make sure that you make it. It's not an option maybe for many, especially if you think about more well-off parents, then it's not an option to not go to university, and then they have to make sure.
Any questions or online or?
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I was very interested because I taught in this university for many years. So I wanted to have a broad understanding of what I was doing. I have only one question. It's about your. Can we say that it's similar for women and men? So the gender perspective.
Oh yes, the gender perspective is super interesting. But to keep it simple, I did not. You could, of course, make a second model, or make one model for men, one for women. And then we come back to the first thing I said maybe before the presentation, is that the ideal life course in Japan was always like going through these institutions, right? And then maybe have a happy life later because you achieve this. But this was always the male perspective. For women, it's also expected they go through up to here, also enter maybe a company, but then mostly it's about marriage, getting children, and then dropping out. Which is actually what we still see in the data, that children or that the women up to this point do more or less the same thing. And it's also very important to have good performance, go to judo, because all these things are still important. But then what becomes more important is to marry and to have children. Since they're very early, these differences are not pronounced in this data yet so much. If you have, I also did analysis of data ranging into like the 30s or something, and you see this very, very clearly still that most women, it's likelihood if you are married or you have children or both, then that you just drop out. And of course, this reduces your income massively, the time you work, and so on and so forth. And also affects when you're happy, depending on whether you're married or not.
Also, in fact, I observed that many women dropped out very quickly after their first job because they are insatisfied. So I think that maybe the happiness could be a little bit different from men who will keep their job or try to keep their job, but women are more, because of what you said about marriage, they're more free to move and try to find or to satisfy. So I think that maybe at the end about university and the job hunting, there is something different.
I do think so. Yeah, we also we have another project. And Christian just introduced at the beginning a project now in Zurich where we look at transnational mobility of Japanese. And then we look at this gender perspective a lot because we know that women are more likely to actually go abroad and study and so on. And we have also an increase among Japanese students. And what we saw now with another data set that we could use to a certain degree is that there are huge gender differences also in how alternative pathways are actually used. And what we see is that transnational mobility is something that can actually play out for women quite significantly, if not as much as for men sometimes, but in comparison to other women, they are more likely to actually pursue a career also instead of. But the big thing that we found like as a pattern in the data is that for women, it's either one or the other all the time. So they either pursue a career, and there's a very small proportion still, even though we see an increase in managerial positions and so on among women in Japan as well. But international comparison is very, very low still. Or they marry and then have kids and then they drop out very fast, very often, yes. So this is still the Japanese way, even though we see there is development. So, but not sure how long it's taking.
2 or 3 years ago, I think the rate for female workers to quit their job in the first year was 1 on 2.
Okay.
And for men, 1 on 3.
Which is also high, yeah.
In the first year, just after the intern and because one thing's changed is that the job they found now after the university is not at all the job that they found after university 20 years ago.
Yes.
It changed completely. There is a big dissatisfaction about the first job, which was completely different a long time ago in Japan, especially in the parents' generation of these kids. There is a question from Kariya, if you want to.
Okay. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think, could you show me the result of the SEM? I think a structure equation model again.
I hope so. Can you see it now?
No, I cannot see.
Okay, but
Oh, thank you. Well, I have two questions. One is the how you measure SES. I think you use the subjective responses to, I mean, that what your wealthy, I think at age 15, is that kind of the variable you use SES?
Mhm.
Did you?
I use the measure that I introduced before, yes, which is very simple. It's this one. So this is
So that is the, yeah, if you use that, I think it's a retrospective, right? It's retrospective, asking when you were at 15, what level of your, so that means that probably that subjective and retrospective kind of measurement SES should be, I think, influenced by current positions. And then, but I think in the Shaken's longitudinal data, young people should increase parental education or parental occupation. No, I think more objective measurement of SES.
Yeah, there's actually a problem with this data because they did not include income at this point.
Not income, but if you include occupation or education, it's more accurate than the subjective one. And then, because I was very surprised at the result of your SEM, I think structure equation model. I think the direct effect of SES is very big on the happiness, right?
It's true. Yeah.
It's very, very strong. But if it were retrospective and subjective, it's probably, I mean, if you're happy, you just look back positively. So then you can just say that my 15 years old family income is higher than, so that's kind of, I think, subjective, both subjective variables may correlate higher. That is one possible interpretation. I wonder why SES is so high. I mean, the effect. And then second question is about labor market situations outcome. I mean, well, your measurement of that Shuka's result is company size. But I think if you compare that two cohorts, I mean, two different groups of age groups, of course that, in regular workers, I mean, the part of, non-regular workers increased a lot, I think. So that if you had a different measurement of the result of Shukatsu, that might be, I think, another different result you can see. So that I wonder why you use that on the company side, but it's all I think say shine people, right? So that if you can include regular, non-regular, or other types of occupation that after as a result of Shukatsu, possibly result may be different.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very important.
But I think that's very interesting, and a very important kind of research you have done. I think particularly you looked at the happiness, and then if you can, well, this is your main topic is comparing before Yutori and after Yutori. But if you look at the later years of happiness, I mean, that is another important, like 30s or 40s. I mean, what kind of the result of the school experiences, I mean, have influences on happiness in the 30s or 40s. I mean, that might be interesting. And then I was shocked by looking at the bullying has the negative effect of university. Oh, no. Truancy has a negative effect of university attendance. And then also bullying has a negative effect of happiness. Even, when they are young, they are bullied, and then, but still that trauma or, remain. That is shocking result. Thank you very much. I think it's very stimulating.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's actually very, very important comments on the data where I'm also not yet satisfied enough with what I can do actually with the data. SES, definitely you can use education, occupation, these things. Also thinking still about how I can do this better. Maybe also have an industry with education or occupation, something like that. I just started with the topic, so this is why I'm not yet there. But thank you so much for these comments, because I was thinking in a similar direction. The one problem I cannot solve is following these cohorts for longer, right? And then really seeing later in their life how this is working out. So this is still something I could do this for older cohorts, to looking like in their happiness. But since the study only started 2007, I don't have all the data I would need maybe. So for an old cohort, we could see whether there's a long-term effect maybe from IGME on happiness or something that we could do. Thank you. That would be very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe the last question, if any, online or in the room. No?
Thank you so much for your presentation, and it was very interesting for me. And I was actually I go for usually. I was student in junior high school and high school student, so it's really like revisiting my year of school here. And so, and my research question is also like competition at school, and then emotion, perception, and competition at school. School. And just I would like to general question about for the future of Japan, how to select the students as a system of education. I would mean that because the competition always to be precise in the situation, governments and professors and a group of syndicates of professors, the competition is really like be precise. But I also analyzing the sociology of Gmail, and recently Hammer composer and sociologist Arno published the article about the competition about form social, and I agree about this point of view of Gmail and Hammer composer, because the competition is very improved the system of modern system, because you know how to select the people, the students at the school system. Because recently the Japanese people discuss about the new school selection system about without exam, interviews or analyze documents, etc. But it's very maybe more inequalities between students, because how I will speak English or I can study abroad, it's very like the high level social status. So I don't know, we don't know really understand what is a competition, what is a local competition, social system. And I don't know, I want to ask, I don't know, understand your opinion about competition, because you are so analyzed about very the competition system in Japan, and shadow education concept of shadow education is very interesting for me. And but user choice is doesn't work, because the professor and a lot of people don't really understand what is competition. Out of school, more competition, like increasing the number of students. So I don't know, how to decrease or how to treat the competition in the Japanese system.
Thank you so much. I think the most important question at the end.
Find a solution.
Yes, right. This is actually what we have to think about, right? How can we actually do something about these things, right? Because they're discussed for a long time, and also entrance examination systems have been changed and so on. This is actually it's because the results tend to show more in the direction that not so much has actually changed for the better, right? So what should we do about it? And from my German perspective, when I always have also do comparisons with Germany and the difference in systems and how it works there, I can also show you something. Just very quickly, if we have just a very quickly a little time from a different project where I compared special education as this kind of function for also competitions on in different countries in the US. You see that in all countries there has been a surge and an increase. In Germany, it's still lower than in Japan, for instance. In the US, there's actually something at the high school level that is also going on. You have different types and so on. I have some longitudinal data, and what you see in effect in CAD. So you have Germany, Japan, United States. The effects are very, very different. So what we saw now for Japan, here in the middle, very, very big effects on whether or not you go to university later. For Germany, you have negative effects. For Germany, it's more like you did not go to university when you were with private tutoring about it, prepared and so on. Because the system is completely different in how it works. That actually shows us a lot and how different or how different actually systems can work. It's not to say that in the German system everything is equal. No, we have other ways of maintaining inequality. But there are some things that we could try to think about to change. And the big old argument maybe in the Japanese case, why these entrance examinations and this whole competition that is then evolving before that, right, are so essential and so important. And this is also why they didn't want to change it for a long, long time. So they say, okay, this is a meritocratic instrument, meaning only based on performance you come in, or you don't, or you have higher scores or lower scores. The same in the US, where they had the SAT and when they introduced it in the 20s or something, same argument. But what they, of course, forget with this argument is that the people come from very different backgrounds, with very different resources. What we saw just going through it until you reach this kind of points, so much is happening that there are just a few students have much better chances than other students. And what in Japan is happening, and it's similar to the US, very, very different to Germany, is that you think about the students as being very similar in this regard. So they have the same potential. It's also what the Takehiko called the gambari. So they just have to put in effort. If they put in enough effort, they can achieve everything. So if they don't achieve, that means they haven't put enough effort in. So that's their problem. In the US, it's similar with like pursuit of happiness or something, where you can make it from a dishwasher to a millionaire. It depends on you. Of course, completely blends out all these structural, institutional settings that you have and the resource that you have or don't have, which is a big problem. Germany is the other way around.
Yeah. So the junior high school student separate for the junior high school for work or for academic university.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very.
We have the tradition. It's a tripartite system with 3 different tracks, and depending what track you're in, you either directly after 10th grade go into the vocational sector, or you can go on and do high school and then actually be allowed to actually go to university. We changed a lot since the big PISA shock 20 years ago. There's more mobility between tracks and so on. There's more happening, but still we have very, very early selection after 4th grade into secondary tracks. So this is where we keep the inequality, but we're just deciding much too early who is supposed to go where. And so the Japanese do it more. It's a mixed tracking system in Japan. It's a more individual kind of system, a tracking system in the US. And in Germany, it's an early tracking system. And if you track, the earlier you track students, and put them in these different routes towards success or not, right? The more it will last somehow. This is still the big problem.
It's very difficult to which balance, which system is fair for the society.
And you know about the ground functions of schools in every society. If you go with the literature, we have Helmut Fenter or something, I'm not sure if you know it, but one of the basic functions, of course, is selection. But the other one is also equality, so making everything or reducing inequality between students on a performance level. So when students come into school, they're very different. They're very different performance or potential performance levels. And the function of school, first and foremost, is to equalize that. And they do that early on in primary school. And this is actually working quite well in most societies. But then selection function comes in, and then you have to, for the allocation, then to the higher tracks, you have them select them. Yeah, these questions for Japan also. I think Kariya wrote a paper, and I also wrote a paper about Sentaku versus Senbatsu. So whether it's selection or whether it's choice of students, where they go, and so on. My bottom line was it's still a lot of selection for Japan, but so individual choice means you really have a choice, and it's also debatable given the system. Sorry.
Another function in the question.
Yes.
All the students are these objectives. I think we are going to stop here. I will have just one question, and maybe a question for next time you will come here after your project you are doing now. But my question was, in your research, actual research or future research, do today youth trajectories suggest emerging model of happiness or success that move away from the traditional educational expectations? I mean, is young happiness after university today the same than happiness was for the generation before?
Yeah.
Because you can have, I think, you can have today happiness after university, even for people who don't success to the criteria of what happiness was supposed to be, for example, for the parents' generation. So, do you see new things emerging here, or Japanese youth are still in the project? Because if they are still on the same pattern than the parents' generation, you can suppose that the unhappiness will be more and more important.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if the happiness level is the same, doesn't that mean that in fact the criteria of happiness changed?
Yeah. There is a nice, so yeah, thank you for the question. It's very important. So I do think there is change in the mentality on what you perceive or what you think are the things that make you happy in the end. And I think there is a change happening because life conditions have changed a lot. And we see this also for Japan. And I do feel that they very well know what makes them happy, maybe. But on the other side, they also feel these institutional pressures, then the expectations of the parents and everything. And they also know what they should do. So that is all. I think maybe it's for them. It's gotten harder to actually decide which way to go, whether to do what you're expected to, or maybe try some new things and so on. And what I think is what we right now see is a very slow, gradual change of more and more people trying to just get out of and maybe do something a little bit different, at least. But it doesn't mean that it always works out and that they can actually. So, but maybe there's a little change happening. There's a good work from Carola Hommerich actually on the topic of happiness, well-being of youth, and so on. And they also compared different cohorts over time and tried to find reasons why. Because what they found in the latest samples is that the youth is happier than compared to maybe people from the 80s, 70s, and so on, right? So born much earlier. So the latest cohorts are much happier on average. And this is hardly explainable somehow because the conditions have gone down. So, and one of the explanations is, of course, people born in the late 80s, 90s, they never experienced the booming Japan, like with the economy and everything, right? So they just know this, and then they find their happiness there in different fashions. So, for example, what the data also showed is that maybe income and so on is not that important anymore for whether you feel good or not. And then what they also discussed, and what I think is also right, and what the data also showed is that still you also have maybe more people trying to disconnect from society altogether. Like if you think about the hikikomori and things like that. So the people say, I can't deal with that anymore and just So there are maybe in both directions. And I think the middle, the proportion of people just being in the middle, just doing everything as expected as it was, is getting a little smaller. And then on the sides, it's getting.
So thank you very much. So we are going to stop here. Thank you to Takehiko from Japan for your presentation and discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for all the people online. And so see you next time.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good night.